I'm Samuel, and I've been bartending at the Last Call for nearly 5 years. It's the kind of place that doesn't attract much attention, but it has its regulars. The old ones come for the cheap drinks, the younger ones come for the music. For me, it was just a job, but something happened last night, something I can't explain. It started as any other shift. I walked into the dimly lit bar, greeted the regulars, wiped down the counter, and prepared for another slow night. But then, the new guy walked in. His name was Ethan, and he seemed like any other patron, tall, handsome, and dressed in a worn-out leather jacket. He was quiet, though, just sitting at the far end of the bar, nursing a drink. He ordered a whiskey, and as I poured it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was something about his eyes, deep dark eyes, that looked almost too empty. I tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe it was just the dim lighting or my imagination. But as the night wore on, I began to notice more oddities. He never once moved from his seat. His glass never seemed too empty. Every time I looked at it, the whiskey level stayed exactly the same. It was almost as if time itself was standing still for him. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. I kept looking over at him, wondering if he was a ghost, if maybe he wasn't real. But when I tried to approach him, my feet wouldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to take a single step closer. And that's when it happened. Around midnight, the lights flickered. The usual hum of the jukebox died, and that's when the glass broke. It wasn't Ethan's glass. It was the oldest glass in the bar, the one that no one ever uses anymore. It had been there since the bar opened, a relic from the past, and for some reason, the glass shattered into pieces, even though no one was near it. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that the glass never touched the floor. It simply vanished. Not a single shard remained. It was as if the glass had been swallowed by the air itself. I stood frozen in place. The air felt thick, suffocating. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that I could see my breath. Ethan didn't seem to notice. He just sat there, staring straight ahead with those empty eyes. I turned to the bartender on duty, but he was gone. The bar was empty, now completely empty except for me and Ethan. I could feel a presence behind me, an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders, a cold, dreadful presence. I slowly turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The glass reappeared. It was sitting on the counter, whole and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. I blinked, and it was gone again, vanished into thin air. "Do you see it too?" I whispered, my voice shaking. I turned to Ethan, but his face was now different. His once empty eyes were filled with a deep, black void. He smiled. "You shouldn't be here, Samuel." And with that, the room went completely black. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was trapped in that suffocating silence, surrounded by darkness. I woke up in the bar the next morning, the usual sounds of clinking glasses and murmurs from regulars filling the air. The glass was back, sitting quietly on the shelf, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. Ethan wasn't just a patron. He was something else, and the glass that never breaks. It's a curse, a reminder that once you step into the last call, you never truly leave. My name is Jake Williams, and I work at a dive bar on the outskirts of town. It's one of those places that doesn't get much traffic, but the regulars are loyal, and the drinks are cheap. It's not much, but it's home. There's something about this place, though, something strange. It's the way the walls always seem to hum, the way the air feels thicker when the sun sets. I've heard the stories, the rumors about the bar being haunted. I used to laugh them off. That is, until the night I met him. It was a slow evening. As usual, I was cleaning glasses, glancing up occasionally to check on the few patrons at the bar. That's when I first saw him, the new bartender. He wasn't anyone I recognized. He wasn't even on the schedule. He just appeared, standing behind the bar as if he'd always been there. "Can I get you a drink?" he asked in a soft voice, his eyes barely meeting mine. I shrugged it off, assuming he was just another local looking for a job. But there was something off about him, something wrong. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, like he was performing a routine he didn't fully understand. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to make sense of what was going on. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached for a bottle behind the counter, his hands slow and deliberate. As he poured a drink, I noticed something strange. His reflection didn't show in the glass. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath, leaning in to get a better look. But when I blinked, it was gone. The reflection was back. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it stuck with me. The man's eyes followed me as I walked past him, and I could have sworn I heard him whisper something, though his lips never moved. The bar was getting quieter by the minute. Only one regular remained, an old guy who drank whiskey like water. He was the only one still sitting at the bar. His eyes glazed over in a daze. That's when the whispers started. At first, it was soft, just faint murmurs, like someone speaking just out of earshot. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more urgent. The man behind the bar didn't seem to notice. He just kept pouring drinks, his movements becoming more erratic, like he was trying to keep up with the voices. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the whispers turned into words. "Jake, it's not too late." The voice came from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The bartender was still pouring, but his face was now expressionless, like he was lost in thought. I took a step toward him, my heart racing, but before I could reach him, the door to the back room opened. And there, standing in the doorway, was a woman in a tattered dress, her face covered by a veil. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. The whispers were louder now, overwhelming. I couldn't hear myself think. I stumbled back, hitting the bar in a panic. That's when I saw it. The bartender, the one I had thought was so strange, was standing in front of me, his mouth agape, but he wasn't moving. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and then he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here, Jake. You're just like the others." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room began to spin, the walls closing in. The woman in the doorway stepped forward, her veil lifting just enough to reveal her empty, hollow eyes. I tried to escape, but the door wouldn't open. The air thickened around me, suffocating me. The bartender didn't move, but his voice echoed in my ears. "You'll never leave." I don't know how long I was trapped in that bar, but when I woke up, the place was empty. The woman, the bartender, and the whispers, they were all gone. But I knew something wasn't right. Something about that place had changed, and every time I step into the rusted tap, I feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to join them. I'm Tessa, the bartender at the Shattered Glass, a bar that has stood for over 50 years. It's been the same place for as long as I can remember. Dim lights, wood-paneled walls, and a strange, almost melancholic vibe that hangs in the air. But there's one thing that I've never told anyone. Not a single soul. The bar isn't just haunted, it's alive. I didn't believe it at first. When I first started working here, I thought the rumors about strange occurrences were just stories, to make the place seem more interesting. The lights flickering, the cold spots near the bathrooms, the occasional creaking of the floorboards when no one was around. It all seemed like the kind of thing you'd expect from an old building. But then, I saw it one evening, around closing time. I was cleaning the bar, alone, as usual. It was nearly 3 a.m., and the last few patrons had left, leaving the place eerily quiet. That's when I saw a figure in the corner of my eye. It wasn't a person, but a shadow, a tall, dark silhouette, standing in the farthest corner of the room, near the old jukebox. I turned to look directly at it, but it was gone. I thought I was just imagining things, so I continued my work. But then it happened again. This time, the shadow moved. Slowly, it glided across the floor, moving closer to me. My heart raced as I stared at it, frozen. The bar suddenly felt colder, the air thicker, and then I heard a Tay voice. It wasn't loud. It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Tessa, ... It's almost time. I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't one of the regulars, not someone I had heard before. I quickly turned around, but no one was there. Shaking, I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The lights flickered above me, and the jukebox, which had been silent for hours, suddenly hummed to life, playing an old song I didn't recognize. I tried to unplug it, but the moment my fingers touched the plug, the jukebox stopped playing. I backed away, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was deafening. Then, just as I was about to leave for the night, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I turned around to see a man standing at the bar. He looked out of place, even for this place. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he wore a long dark coat that seemed to swallow him whole. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. But the man didn't respond. He simply smiled, his lips curling into a thin, unsettling grin. And then, in a voice so low I could barely hear it, he said, "I've been waiting for you, Tessa." I felt a chill run through me as the world around me seemed to tilt. The bar was no longer just the familiar place I had worked in for so long. It was something else, something darker, more sinister. The walls seemed to close in, and the man's eyes, those dark, empty eyes, seemed to pierce right through me. Before I could move, the door slammed shut. The lights flickered once more, and the jukebox began playing again, this time louder than ever. The man stood up and slowly walked toward me, his footsteps echoing in the silent bar. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, and my hands shook as I backed away. "You can't leave now, Tessa." His voice was now louder, but it didn't sound like a man's voice at all. It was distorted, like it was coming from a place far deeper than his throat. "You belong here now." I ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The man was right behind me, and I could feel his presence growing stronger, suffocating me. I don't remember how I managed to get out. All I know is that I never went back to the shattered glass. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that song, and I wonder if the bar is still waiting for me to come back. My name's Mason Cruz, and I've worked at a lot of bars over the years, but none like the Lantern's Edge. It's not the kind of place that attracts crowds. Most people don't even know it exists. It's tucked away at the end of an old street, under a flickering neon sign that barely works. It's a place for the lost, the broken, and the ones who don't belong anywhere else. One night, when I was working late alone, a man walked in. He didn't look like someone I'd seen around before. Lance, that's what he told me his name was. He was tall, with dark hair, and a face that was hard to read. He wasn't a talker, just took a seat at the bar and stared into his drink. I didn't think much of it at first, but then, around 2:45 a.m., something strange happened. The bar was about to close, and the silence felt unnerving. The kind of silence you only feel when something isn't quite right. Lance suddenly turned to me. "One more drink before I go." His voice was low, almost like he was speaking in a whisper. I nodded, preparing his order, but something about his eyes made me hesitate. They weren't quite right empty, almost too still. But I shrugged it off, blaming it on fatigue, as I slid the glass over to him. I noticed a strange shadow flickering in the corner of my eye. I looked up, and for a moment, I thought I saw the door behind Lance open. But when I blinked, it was still closed. I shrugged again, trying to shake the feeling of unease. But when I turned back to Lance, something was different. The air around him had grown cold, and the room seemed to shift. The lights above us flickered, and the clock on the wall ticked louder. Time seemed to stretch and distort. It was like we were in a place that wasn't quite part of the world anymore. Lance looked at me with a strange grin on his face. "You know what they say about last calls, right?" he asked, his tone suddenly unsettling. I didn't answer, too caught up in the strange, icy grip that had taken hold of the bar. The whispers began then. They weren't coming from Lance, but from everywhere. Soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "It's not your time, Mason." I glanced around, my heart racing. The bar was empty, but it felt full of something. Something watching me. Lance didn't speak again, but his eyes were fixed on the clock. The second hand ticked faster, then suddenly stopped. The bar fell completely silent. And then it happened. Lance stood up from his seat, his movements smooth, almost mechanical. He walked toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, he stopped. "I won't be the last." His voice sent a shiver down my spine. The door opened on its own, and before I could say anything, Lance stepped out, disappearing into the night. The door slammed shut, and the bar returned to its usual silence. But something was different. I couldn't place it at first, but then I noticed the clock. It wasn't ticking anymore. It wasn't even running. The time had stopped, and as I stood there, frozen, I heard it, the faintest whisper in the darkness. "It's your turn next." I never saw Lance again, but after that night, the bar felt different. The patrons, the air, it all had a strange weight to it, like we were all just waiting for something. And I knew it was only a matter of time before the next person who walked into that bar would feel it too. And that's when I realized the last call isn't just for the end of the night. It's for the end of something much worse. I'm Liam Hart, a bartender at the Rusty Barrel, a bar that's been around for decades, but no one really talks about it much. It's not a place you go for a good time. It's the kind of place you go when you have no other choice, when you're looking for something different, something dark. One evening, a man named George came into the bar. He wasn't a regular, but he wasn't new either. He had a rough look about him, as though life had beaten him down time and time again. His face was weathered, and his eyes, they were the kind of eyes you only see in people who've seen too much, done too much. He didn't order a drink at first. Instead, he sat at the bar and just stared at the empty glass in front of him. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't acknowledge the other patrons. I assumed he was just another drunk looking to drown his sorrows. But then, something strange happened. George raised his glass, but he didn't take a sip. Instead, he held it up and quietly whispered, "To the ones who never made it out." I froze. It was a weird toast, one I'd never heard before. I've been bartending for years, and I've heard my share of odd toasts, but this one felt wrong. Suddenly, the room grew cold. The laughter, the chatter, everything stopped. I turned to look around, but the patrons, the other workers, they were all frozen, not moving, just staring at George. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. It felt like something was blocking me, like there was an invisible force keeping me silent. That's when I saw it. The mirrors behind the bar. They weren't reflecting the room. They were reflecting something else. Shadows, figures, people who weren't in the bar. I could see them moving, slowly, lurking behind the patrons. But they weren't alive. They were the dead, the ones who had never made it out of the bar. I tried to look away, but the mirrors seemed to draw me in. My heart raced. My hands started to sweat. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. George's voice broke the silence. "You see them now, don't you?" he said, turning his gaze to me. "They're here. They've always been here. And they're waiting for you." I stumbled back, finally able to move. But the room didn't feel like it used to. It was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The patrons, those shadows, were now in front of me, whispering in voices that echoed in my mind. They didn't speak words, they spoke feelings, regret, fear, pain. It was overwhelming. George stood up, slowly, almost like he was floating. The shadows seemed to follow him. There's no escaping it. Liam, you're part of this now. You belong here, with us. I backed away, but the bar seemed to stretch, the walls closing in. The door wouldn't open. The windows were covered in a thick fog. I couldn't breathe, and then I saw them, the eyes. Cold, hollow, lifeless eyes, watching me from every corner of the bar. Eyes that had once belonged to people who'd come in just like I had. People who had raised their glasses, made toasts, and never left. I don't know how I got out that night, but I did. I ran. I've never gone back to the Rusty Barrel, and I never will. But the memories, they won't go away. Every time I close my eyes, I see George. And every time I hear a glass clink, I hear that toast. To the ones who never made it out. And I wonder who's next. I'm Dylan Pierce, the bartender at Whispers, a small bar tucked away in an alley where most people don't even know it exists. It's one of those places you stumble upon when you're looking for something, or someone, and most people who find it usually don't leave the same way they came in. I've been working there for almost a year, and in that time, I've seen things that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality, but nothing. Nothing could have prepared me for the events that unfolded one particular night. It started like any other evening. The usual patrons were there, drunk and laughing, talking about their meaningless lives. It was the lull between the rush of closing time and the dead silence of the early morning hours. That's when he showed up. He entered at precisely midnight, as if the clock had struck for him. His name was Victor. At least, that's what he said. But his eyes, dark and hollow, never seemed to match his calm demeanor. They were empty, lifeless, like they belonged to someone who had seen far too much. He sat at the bar, but he didn't order a drink. Instead, he just stared at the clock above the door, watching the seconds tick by. The other patrons seemed to avoid him, as though there was something in his presence that made them uneasy. I tried to offer him a drink, but he simply nodded and gestured for me to wait. So I did, watching him as he stared at the clock, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden counter. Tick, tick, to minutes dragged on. Something felt off. The air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. And that's when I heard it, the whisper. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the neon sign outside. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, closer this time. Tick-tock. You're running out of time. I looked around the room. No one else seemed to hear it, but I did, and so did Victor. He wasn't staring at the clock anymore. His eyes were locked onto mine, and for the first time since he walked in, he spoke. You heard it too, didn't you? I felt a chill run through me. How did he know? It's not the clock that counts, he said in a low, almost mechanical voice. It's the moments, and the moments are running out for you, Dylan. I tried to laugh it off, but the air in the bar grew cold, colder than I could remember. I could see my breath, even though the heat was on, and then the lights flickered. The music stopped. The bar fell into a silence that felt like it had been there for years. The clock on the wall began ticking louder, faster. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Victor's smile grew wider, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile of someone who knew, a secreter's secret that could destroy me. Suddenly, the room around us started to change. The walls warped, and the floor began to stretch. The other patrons disappeared, replaced by shadows, flickering in and out of view. The clock seemed to be growing louder, like it was alive, like it was pulling everything into its grasp. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Victor's voice broke through the chaos. Time is the one thing you can never escape. Dylan, you'll Learned that the hard way. Before I could react, he stood up and walked out of the bar. The door slammed behind him, and the clock went silent. The lights came back on, the warmth returned, and the room was exactly as it had been before, except the clock was gone. I haven't seen Victor since that night, but I know he's still out there, somewhere, waiting. Every night, when the clock strikes midnight, I hear his voice in the back of my mind. You're running out of time, and I wonder, how much time do I really have left? My name is Jason Calloway, and I've been a bartender at Grimm's Tavern for as long as I can remember. It's a hole-in-the-wall kind of place that barely gets any customers anymore. Not that we mind. The regulars are all that keep the place. Alive old men with stories of the past, each one stranger than the last. But there's always been something strange about Grimm's Tavern. Something I can't quite put my finger on. It all started after the new owner, Grimm, took over. He was a mysterious man with dark eyes and an even darker past. No one knew where he came from, and no one dared to ask. His mere presence felt oppressive, like the bar itself was alive, watching us. One rainy night, a storm rolled in, the winds howling and the thunder shaking the walls of the tavern. It was dead quiet, except for the sound of the rain hitting the windows and the hum of the neon beer sign flickering above the door. I was behind the bar, cleaning glasses, when a man walked in. He looked out of place, too clean, too well-dressed for a bar like this. His hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with an air of confidence that made everyone else seem small in comparison. He sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and started chatting with me. His name was Edward, and at first, I thought he was just another rich guy passing through. But there was something about his voice, it was like it echoed in my mind. His words weren't normal. They felt forced, like he was saying them for a reason. He asked about Grimm, and that's when things got weird. I tried to change the subject, but Edward kept pushing. He seemed obsessed with the history of the tavern, the old stories about ghosts and strange occurrences. I told him the usual stories, how people claim to hear footsteps when no one's around, or how the lights flicker at night. But Edward wasn't satisfied. There's something more, isn't there? He pressed. Something darker. I froze. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something. That's when I noticed the mirror behind the bar, the one that reflected the entire tavern. But tonight, it was different. In the reflection, I could see Grimm standing in the shadows, staring directly at Edward. But when I looked over at the corner, Grimm wasn't there. I started to feel sick. Edward's smile faded, and he leaned in closer. You can feel it too, can't you? Before I could answer, the door slammed open, and a gust of wind blew through the tavern, extinguishing the candles on the tables. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered once again. Then, I heard a voice, low and gravelly, coming from somewhere deep within the tavern. It wasn't Grimm, but it sounded like it was coming from him. You shouldn't have come here. Edward's face went pale. He tried to stand up, but his chair scraped violently against the floor, as if being pushed back by an unseen force. The room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and breathing. Edward looked at me with terror in his eyes. I reached for the phone, but it wasn't there. The whole tavern felt wrong, as if time itself was bending. The air grew thick, and a shadow loomed over the bar, engulfing everything. Double quotes, leave, ... Now. Grimm's voice echoed, even though he was nowhere near us. Suddenly, Edward collapsed on the floor, his body convulsing violently. I tried to help him, but when I touched him, his skin was ice cold, like he wasn't even human. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he let out a scream that rattled the entire building. Then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The room was silent. The storm outside had died down, and the lights came back on. Edward was gone, vanished. The only trace of him was the glass of whiskey that had been knocked over on the bar. I never saw Edward again, but I know something happened that night. Grim. He's not human. He's something else, something old. And Grim's Tavern. It's no ordinary bar. It's a place for people who are trapped, people who can never leave. So if you ever find yourself passing through town, and you happen to see a sign that says Grim's Tavern, just keep walking. Don't go in. Don't sit at the bar, and never, ever make eye contact with Grim. My name is Marcus Stone, and I've been bartending at the Crooked Horn for almost 5 years. It's a small, old bar on the edge of town, one of those places where time seems to stand still. The same faces, the same worn-down furniture, and the same stories. It's nothing special, but there's a certain comfort in its familiarity. But something happened one night that I can't explain. It was just another Tuesday evening. The bar nearly empty, except for a few regulars nursing their drinks. I was cleaning glasses behind the counter when a strange man walked in. He was tall, with pale skin and deep-set eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He didn't say a word, just sat down at the farthest corner of the bar, where the shadows seemed to gather more than usual. I didn't think much of it at first. New faces come and go all the time. But there was something unsettling about him. It wasn't his appearance, it was the way he acted. He sat there, completely still, 4 hours. Not a single sip from his drink, no movement, no change in his expression. Around midnight, a woman entered the bar. She was young, in her 20s, with dark hair and a nervous energy about her. She walked up to the counter and ordered a drink, glancing over at the man in the corner every few seconds. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling. I could tell something was off, but I didn't ask. I was about to clean up the glasses when the woman suddenly walked over to the corner, where the strange man was sitting. She stood there for a long moment, staring at him, as if she was waiting for something. Then, with a shaky breath, she pulled up the empty chair beside him and sat down. For a moment, I thought I saw the corner of the man's lips twitch into a smile, but it was more like a grimace. The woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it time?" The man didn't answer. He just sat there, unmoving, like a statue. The atmosphere in the bar suddenly felt heavier, colder. It was as if the air itself was thick with something unnatural. I started to feel it, too. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the woman stood up, as if in a trance, and walked toward the door. The man's eyes followed her, his gaze sharp, almost predatory. Before she could leave, I heard him speak. His voice was low, barely audible, but it carried across the room. "You know where to find me." The woman froze at the door, but she didn't turn around. She just stood there for a long moment, then left without a word. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just happened. The next morning, the woman's body was found in the alley behind the bar. She had been brutally murdered, her face twisted in a permanent expression of horror. The police said it looked like something had torn into her, but there were no signs of a struggle, no marks on her hands or arms, just that awful look of terror. The strange man was gone. No one knew who he was or where he went. I've been working here since then, but I can't forget what happened that night. The bar has never felt the same. The empty chair at the corner of the bar is always waiting, and sometimes, when the lights flicker just right, I can see him sitting there again, his pale eyes staring at me. And every now and then, I hear a faint whisper in the dark, as if someone is asking, "Is it time?" My name is Ethan Blake, and I've been working at the Blackthorn Bar for over a year now. It's a quiet place, the kind of dive bar that's been around for decades. The same regulars come in every night, sipping their whiskey, telling the same old stories, and staying until closing time. But something changed one night, something I can't explain. It was a cold Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the wind howls and the streets are empty. The bar was nearly deserted, save for a man in the corner booth. I noticed him the moment he walked in. He was tall, wearing a long black coat, and had eyes that looked strangely hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't speak to anyone, just took a seat and stared at the wall, his drink untouched in front of him. I've worked at this bar long enough to know when something's off, and this guy felt wrong. But I didn't think much of it. People have their weird moods, right? At around midnight, the man stood up and walked toward the door, but he paused as he reached it. He turned to look at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something unnatural. His eyes glowed, just for a moment, a deep red. He didn't speak, but I swear he grinned. Then, he left. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks. But that night, the strange happenings began. The first incident happened just after the man left. I was cleaning the bar, when suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. It's not uncommon for the lights to flicker in old buildings, but when they came back on, I noticed something odd. Every single drink glass in the bar had been turned upside down, except for one, a glass of whiskey, sitting alone on the counter, untouched. I shook it off. I figured one of the regulars had been messing around, but when I looked up, I saw the man again, standing in the corner. His hollow eyes were locked on mine, and for the first time, I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to get out, but as I moved toward the door, everything around me seemed to slow down. The air grew heavier, thicker, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The man wasn't there anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Then, I heard it a whisper. It wasn't from a person, but from the air itself. "You shouldn't have come," it said. I turned around, but there was no one there. The next few nights were even worse. The man never returned, but strange things began happening around the bar. The regulars started acting weird, like they were not themselves. One night, Tom, a regular who always sat at the bar, started talking about dark rituals and strange symbols he had seen carved into the wood. He spoke as if he had done these things, but none of us knew what he was talking about. Then, his face twisted into a grin, one that looked wrong, too wide. I felt my stomach turn. Another night, the jukebox played a song I had never heard before, a haunting melody that echoed through the bar. It was as if the song was calling something dark, something that shouldn't be here. I decided to dig into the history of the bar, searching for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. What I found shook me to my core. The Blackthorn Bar had been built on land that was once used for ritual sacrifices. Years ago, a cult had inhabited the area, performing dark rituals and summoning things from beyond. The bar had been built to cover up the land's history, but it was never truly cleansed. I learned that every time someone stayed too long at the bar, they would begin to feel the effects of those rituals. The spirits, the dark forces, would start to claim them, slowly. The man I saw that night wasn't just a stranger, he was a part of that darkness, a messenger, and he had come to collect. The regulars had been infected, slowly changing over time, and now it was my turn. One night, I saw the man again, standing outside the bar, staring in through the window. This time, his eyes were blood red, and I could hear his voice in my head. "It's your turn now," he whispered. I tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. The bar had become a prison, a place of darkness that wouldn't let me leave. And the man, the messenger, was always watching. Now, I stay in the bar every night. I can't leave. I can't escape. The man's eyes are always with me, and I know that eventually, I will become one of them. I will become part of the darkness. My name is Lily Brooks, and I work as a bartender at a small dive bar in the outskirts of town. The Hollow Oak The bar isn't much to look at, dimly lit with old wooden beams and a dusty collection of bottles behind the counter. It has a strange charm, but there's something about it that always gives me the creeps. It's not the type of place where people come for fancy drinks or good times. The crowd is usually older, locals who've been drinking here for decades. But recently, there's been something off about the place. Something I can't quite explain. A few weeks ago, I noticed a strange man sitting in the far corner. I had never seen him before, and yet, he seemed oddly familiar. He didn't order much, just a beer, and he'd sit there for hours, staring at the bar with a look that made my skin crawl. His name was Carl, he told me, but there was something in his voice, something unsettling. The thing that bothered me the most wasn't Carl himself, though. It was the whispers. At first, I thought I was hearing things, but as the days went by, I realized the whispers were real. They came from the basement, a dark, cold space beneath the bar that no one ever used. The bar owner, Ray, always told us to stay out of there. He said it was off limits because of some old pipes and storage. But there was something about his tone that made me believe there was more to it. One night, I had to go down there to fetch a bottle of whiskey. I was alone in the bar, the place completely silent, except for the soft hum of the fridge. The basement door was heavy and creaked when I opened it. I took a deep breath and descended into the darkness. As soon as I stepped down the first few stairs, I felt the temperature dropped significantly, and I could see my breath in the cold air. The whispers were louder now, faint at first, but soon they grew clearer. "Come down here," the voice whispered. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't move. I wanted to go back up, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if something was pulling me down, forcing me deeper into the basement, at the bottom of the stairs. I saw a dark figure standing in the far corner, its face hidden in shadows. It was tall, almost towering, and it stood motionless. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to run back up the stairs, but before I could reach the top, the basement door slammed shut. I was trapped. The whispers surrounded me, getting louder and more frantic. "Stay with us," they hissed. "Stay forever." Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grip my arm. I screamed, struggling to break free, but the grip was too tight. The figure in the corner began to move, and I could hear its slow, dragging footsteps as it approached. I finally managed to yank my arm free and sprinted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I was shaking, covered in sweat. When I turned to look around, Carl was still sitting in the same corner, but this time, his eyes were glowing. He smiled at me, a twisted, unnatural grin. I could feel the weight of the whispers in the air, even though they were silent now. I didn't know what I had just encountered in that basement, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't human. The next morning, Ray was gone. I didn't ask where he went. I didn't want to know. But the whispers still linger in the air, especially when the bar is quiet. And Carl, he's always there, waiting, watching. I don't know if I'll last much longer in this place, but I know one thing: I'll never, ever go near that basement again.